The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints claims 17.5 million members worldwide. But how many of those numbers are active? On the one hand, the LDS Church claims to have an increase of membership growth in recent years, both due to having children as well as conversions. A recent church newsroom statement says that they had over 300,000 convert baptisms in 2024, and that the calendar year from June 2024 to May 2025 had the most convert baptisms across 12 months in the church's history. This coincides with an increase in missions worldwide, as well as missionaries worldwide, a number that's probably going to go up again due to the surge as a result of the change in age for women going on missions. Yet on the other hand, there has been consistent and clear evidence of a declining number of Latter-day Saints of record remaining active. So the question is, how many of these nearly 18 million members attend church on Sunday? How many hold a temple recommend? How many pay tithing? How many believe? And how does this break across different generations? Are we seeing younger Latter-day Saints more likely to leave or remain? Now, the blunt truth is we may never know the hard evidence to this. The church knows they have detailed records, surveys, meticulous data that they keep at a local level, all passed back to Salt Lake City. Data that they keep restricted from researchers and social scientists. So we are just groping in the dark. And the church itself claims that these stories of large numbers of disaffection is just a quote-unquote narrative. But we also do have evidence that at least in the United States, there is declining participation among Latter-day Saints. We see this both in survey data from social scientists, as well as from the church's own anxiety and how they are responding to what they see as a crisis. So in this video, I'd like to first briefly survey why this numeric growth, this increase in membership has been so central to LDS church claims since its founding, although it radically revised in the 20th century. And then I want to talk about this recent social science data, especially that has appeared in a wonderful essay by Jana Reese, one of the best scholars working on Mormonism, at her column at the Religious News Service. I will link to that story in this video description, and we will dissect why there is enough evidence to know that there is a problem of disaffection, at least among United States Latter-day Saints. On the one hand, numeric growth has always been central to Latter-day Saint truth claims. Mormons look back to an early prophecy from Joseph Smith while he's gathered in a small schoolroom with Latter-day Saints that could fit into one building, prophesying that there will come a day when Latter-day Saints will fill the globe. But that type of narrative that the church's growth is evidence of its chosen status, that it is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, that only became a dominant narrative in the 20th century when the church itself started growing. Because note, here is a chart that's based on the church's public membership data. It took a long time for the church to grow to 1 million members, which they did in 1947. And I will note, growing to 1 million members is a substantial achievement. It's more than nearly any other church has founded during that era. Would also grow, although we can look at the Church of Christ Scientists or the Jehovah's Witnesses of similar churches found in the same era that experienced similar growth. But after it took over a century for the church to achieve its first 1 million members, it only took 2 more decades for them to reach 3 million members. And then the church experienced monumental growth for the rest of the 20th century, doubling its membership about every 15 years. It flabbergasted many outside observers who did not understand how Mormonism was growing so fast. In fact, one scholar of Christianity of the world and in America, Rodney Stark, looked at this data, and in a book on this topic, here you see the cover, He argued that Mormonism is going to be the first major world religion to be created since Islam, and he predicted that they would reach 100 million members within a century or so, numbers that the Latter-day Saints have since fallen short of because that growth has slowed in recent years. But one other key detail that I think is crucial to understanding this growth. The thing that made Latter-day Saints quite unique when compared to other churches growing like this is the Latter-day Saints were very successful in keeping their young. Social scientists attributed this to all these youth programs within the church that allowed young Latter-day Saints to remain faithful and part of the fold with much higher consistency than you would find in other denominations. So in short, throughout much of the second half of the 20th century, Latter-day Saints were known and took pride in their massive growth, which they saw as a key signifier of their chosen status. By the way, if you enjoyed this type of nerdy analysis in which we look at the historical development of Mormonism, religion, politics, culture from the past to the present, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. If you want a way to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have taken this step, you can become a member of this channel, which comes with a few perks like early access to the videos, but it's mostly a way to show your thanks. And again, I'm very grateful for that. If you haven't yet, you can also subscribe to my Kit newsletter, which sends out usually every other week a overview of what I've been up to, linked to videos across my many different platforms, interviews, essays, all those public functions, and advertisements for upcoming events. And finally, the first Wednesday of every month, I do a live discussion on this channel where I talk about a theme that's been on my mind, and then I answer whatever questions are on your mind. And the next time we will be doing this is Wednesday, January 7th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. All right, with all that said, let's get back to today's video. When we talk about the problem of disaffection in the modern LDS church, we need to understand it within the broader context of religious disaffiliation nationwide in the United States. We live in an era of disenchantment toward organized religion, where the fastest religious tradition, and I'm going to put tradition in scare quotes here, the fastest growing religious tradition are the unaffiliated, what we call the spiritual but not religious, those who might have some spiritual beliefs but do not want to belong to a religious institution, let alone pledge loyalty or allegiance to institutions. We are in an age of anti-institutionalism in general. And we see this play out quite clearly in recent social science data. The Pew Religious Landscape Surveys, one of the best surveys we have on religious life in America, has charted the drop in Christian affiliation since the 1960s and 70s. Even in the last couple decades, since 2007, here we have a chart, about 78% of Americans identified as Christian or a part of Christian traditions in 2007. Now, that's down to 63%. And we've seen this stagnate, right? This was a massive drop by 15% over just about 13 years. Since 2020, in fact, they just released an update on the Religious Landscape Survey a few weeks ago. And here is the update that you see here, which is that we've mostly leveled off, staying between 63 and 64% of Christian affiliation. Notably, this does disprove some anecdotal data of people saying that we're seeing a religious revival in the United States and more people are returning to religion. That might happen. That's not showing in any of the data yet. In this broader context of religious disaffiliation, we see the LDS Church certainly struggling with those same issues. And we see this in several ways. Perhaps most importantly, we got some leaked videos from LDS leader training meetings that took place in 2008. These videos were leaked about a decade later in 2016. I'll put a link to a story about these videos in the video description. And in that training video where there's a committee reporting surveying on young Latter-day Saints and their affiliation and their activity, they stated that 30% of young adults in the United States were active, meaning 70% were not. It's even worse worldwide that only 20% of young Latter-day Saint adults were active versus 80% inactive, with an average of about 25%. In other words, the church's own internal discussions, at least according to this 2008 training video, posited that 3/4 of LDS young adults were not active. And we see, even if the church does not give out this data in public, we see them responding to an anxiety that would likely be prompted by that type of data. Marlon Jensen, who was a church historian for a number of years and a wonderful general authority, when speaking to Utah State University students a few years after that, noted that there were waves of Latter-day Saints, quote unquote, waves of young Latter-day Saints encountering difficult or troubling topics that resulted in them leaving the faith, positing that this democratization of information on the internet was causing problems. Terrell Givens, a noted LDS scholar and apologist, likewise once estimated that we are seeing people leave the faith at greater levels than we've seen in the church since the Kirtland era. Perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, making a rhetorical point, but it spoke to this anxiety. In fact, the gospel topic essays that started coming out around this era were in response to internal surveys done that showed that young Latter-day Saints were uncomfortable with discovering these new truths, which resulted in them leaving the faith. So even if we don't have precise numbers during that period, we see the church's institutional response as if they knew there was massive declension and those disaffiliating with the faith, in part due to these internet issues. Which now brings us to our most recent data. Again, I want to say that I'm taking a lot of this material, though not all, I'm taking a lot of it from Jana Reese, the wonderful scholar and journalist who writes for the Religion News Service. Here you see a screenshot of her recent story that talks about LDS disaffection, and I add a link to it in the video description, so make sure to go read it at her website. And she's going to have a part 2 that's coming out. It may be out by the time that this video comes out, talking about how even those remain within the church are adapting their belief in particular ways, responding to modern contexts and circumstances. So on the one hand, we have the church very clearly claiming that it continues to grow, that they're bringing in more converts and children of record. But even if that quantity of saints is expanding, that's still not disproving two things. One, that those in the faith are remaining active and that those activity rates remain large. And two, that growth is still, expanding, but it's expanding at a slower rate than it had in the past. So we have disaffection, they're just disaffecting from the bigger pie. And further, we don't know the differences across nations. So I'm going to be talking about the United States context, because that's where the data that I'm, reading, and that's where my expertise is. Other scholars can talk about the global retention rates, and I would love to read that material. So a few things to keep in mind when we're talking about these social science data sets, these pollings, these surveys to help understand religious activity. One, Latter-day Saints in general are usually a small sample size within much larger research data, which means there is a larger margin of error, and we must always keep that in mind. However, even with taking into consideration the margin of error, it's important to track broader trends over time, right? That if you might quibble over particular numbers, but if you're seeing a direction one way or another, that's something that you can feel a bit more comfortable in. And it's also important to look at studies that are respected. And both of these surveys that I'm going to be talking about today, the LDS Church itself will quote in other contexts when it's convenient for them, showing that even the church themselves, even if they don't highlight the types of numbers I'll be discussing, do recognize the substance and power of these surveys to tell us something about modern society. All right, so the first survey, so Jana Reese in the story highlights two recent surveys that can give us important data points. The first one is the General Social Survey, the GSS, which focuses on another elements going back generations, following the same questions across various traditions, so we can see these broad trends. And they found that the share of those raised in the LDS faith who remained in the church at adulthood dropped from 77% in the 70s and 80s, that is 70% of Latter-day Saints in the 1970s and 80s remained faithful, to just 38% today. That's a major drop. Now, even with their margin of error, which could be 10 points in one way or the other, that still shows a clear and consistent decline across the decades. Now, less dire, but still consistent, is what we see in the Pew Research Landscape survey, which I mentioned earlier, that talked about the broader U.S. religious disaffection. In their survey, LDS retention drop in the last decade and a half dropped from 70% in 2007 to 54% now. Now, note that both of those numbers are different than the general, than the GSS, the General Social Survey, that it is better for Latter-day Saints, right? 54% is better than 38%. But even note, with those more generous numbers, the trend line still is clear that it's going down. And we can see that going down with a particular generation, that younger Latter-day Saints are more likely to leave the fold for a variety of reasons that I might talk about later. So in the GSS, it shows, for instance, that millennials and Gen Z are twice as likely to disaffiliate with the LDS Church. And again, the Pew Religious Landscape Survey is not as bleak, but it's still stark, showing 65% retention for boomers and only 45% for millennials. So again, similar story. A bigger swing in the GSS, but a smaller but still consistent swing in the Pew survey. Now, what are these issues? I think in the 2008 to 2012 period, the major issue was the democratization of knowledge through the internet. I think more recently, the bigger issues are social issues, especially things like gay marriage and homosexuality, the very topics that the LDS Church is feeling we are willing to die on this hill, which is becoming the touchstone for younger Latter-day Saints. There was a big story in the Washington Post magazine a few years ago about the rise of liberal Latter-day Saints. And I and many other scholars were not as, optimistic about that growth, in part because several things can happen. One, those young Latter-day Saints might remain in the faith, remain liberal, and therefore transform the church. But we've seen that that has not really been the case. We could see those young Latter-day Saints remain in the faith and then become conservative. That might happen. Some people become more conservative as they get older. Or the more likely, as we've seen from this research, is that these young Latter-day Saints remain liberal and don't remain in the church. And that seems to be the more likely issue, at least going forward. So now social issues are replacing those knowledge issues, those history issues, those doctrinal issues that had been the spark for leaving before, and now it's topics like gender and sexuality. So how does the LDS Church respond to these issues of disaffiliation? Well, on the one hand, I expect them to continue what they had been doing in the 2008 era, which is trying to respond to the information on the internet, a continuation of these gospel topic essays type projects. I did several videos this last year talking about these topics and questions pages that the church has put out, the Joe Smith Papers Project, all these other things that try to close the gap between what people are finding on the internet and what they get from church-approved sources. You also see, I think, the church's push for retaining members through their massive building plan of LDS temples. I wrote an essay for the Salt Lake Tribune a year ago in which I argued that Russell M. Nelson's ambitious, I think we can call it ambitious, temple building plan reflected his vision of how to keep members in the church. That if every community had a temple, that means everyone in that community had to attend the temple, work at the temple, have a temple recommend, and that's the best way to anchor them in the faith a lot more than just regular church attendance. You also see the church putting in more and more resources into missionary work. And missionary work is important for retention for two things. One, bringing in more members. Obviously, the goal is proselytization. But second, it's meant to bind those young Latter-day Saints to the church at a very impressionable age. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that now we see young women able to go on missions at the age of 18, because the longer you put off the mission, the more likely you don't go on a mission, and therefore the less likely you will be as tied to the LDS church. And then finally, the major thing that churches do in general, not just Mormonism, but churches in general, is adapt to the times. And we see the church itself trying to adapt to fit this new era of disaffiliation and individualized faith. We see the 2-hour church. We see shoulderless garments. We see a less onerous type of institutional overreach in hopes that Latter-day Saints would be willing to stay faithful. So in general, I think we see the LDS church recognizing a problem of disaffiliation and trying to introduce as many solutions as they can to make sure they can keep these members on their roster, because in their belief, that's the best way to bring them happiness in this world and tie the kingdom together for the next. Whenever I speak at public events, one of the most common questions I get is, what source do you really wish you could get access to in the church's archives? They expected that I would say something about someone's diary or so forth, and there's a few that I would certainly say. But the set of sources I really would love to get access to is this membership data that the church has meticulously collected over the last few decades, knowing the activity rates at the very local level across years and states and regions and nations. It's probably the richest data collection of religious life in the world, and no one gets access to it unless you're an LDS church employee. And from what I understand, it's a very small number of church employees who have access to it. That's a shame for us scholars, because it leads us to kind of grope to get whatever data we have. Now, I want to emphasize, the data we have still is pretty good, because it is consistently showing a through line, which is an increasing number of Latter-day Saints who are disaffiliating, becoming disaffected with the LDS church, even as the church itself continues to expand, right? The numbers of the church is growing, even if the activity rate may be shrinking. I think the church's success going forward will be continuing to respond to those very dynamics I've been highlighting, condensing the gap between what people learn on the internet and what they hear from church-approved sources, providing a spiritual anchor, showing the worth, making relevant, sending on missions. These are all elements to try to bind the faith, and we'll see if it works. Historians make horrible profits. I don't know if this rate of disaffection is going to grow or if it's going to shrink. That's what future historians are going to say. But I do think this topic reminds us of why history is still relevant, because it can put into context this obsession with numerical data and social surveys, and this why trying to see this demographic growth is crucial to LDS truth claims. We can place all of those ideas in context, even as we are dissecting the data upon which this analysis is built. I hope this analysis makes sense. If so, make sure to hit the like button, share the videos with others so we can broaden the discussion. And if you enjoy this type of analysis, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. And if you want to give back, you can become a member. History has never been more relevant than it is today, because it allows us to see where these discussions come from, which reveals as much about us as a community as even the answers to these questions might.